A few years ago, I decided to take a much-needed break from everything. Work was getting overwhelming and I just wanted to disconnect, so I rented a small cabin in the woods. The cabin was cozy, nestled far from any town, the perfect place for a winter escape. The snow had already started falling, and the surroundings were quiet, eerily quiet. I arrived late in the evening, unpacked, and settled in for a few days of peace. Little did I know those days would be anything but peaceful. The first night, everything seemed fine. I made a fire, unpacked some food, and settled in with a book. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin was warm and comforting. Around midnight, I started to feel off. It was that subtle unease that you can't really place but can't ignore either. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the isolation. I was used to being alone, but being that far away from everyone and everything felt different, like the silence was too loud. Around 2 a.m., I heard a knock on the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the knocking came again, more deliberate this time. My heart rate picked up. I was miles away from the nearest neighbor, so who could possibly be out there in this storm? I hesitated, not sure what to do. Should I open the door? Was it someone who needed help? Or was it a prank? After a long pause, I decided to check through the cabin window, just to see if I could spot anyone. I stood by the window, heart pounding, trying to peer through the heavy snow. It was hard to see anything, but there, just at the edge of the yard, I saw a figure standing motionless in the snow. They were facing the cabin, barely moving. I froze. Who would be out there at this hour, and why weren't they knocking again? I stayed by the window, watching, my mind racing. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then, without warning, they turned and disappeared into the trees. I don't know how, but I knew they weren't just walking away. It was like they vanished, without leaving a trace. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed up, waiting for another knock, or for something else to happen. Nothing did. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was the snow playing tricks on me, or the wind making shadows look like people. But as I walked around the cabin to gather some wood for the fire, I saw the footprints. The snow around the cabin was untouched except for a pair of footprints that led from the edge of the yard up to the door, and then stopped right there. There were no other tracks leading away from the door, nothing. I didn't stay another night. I packed up my things and left, not bothering to check out or even return the key. I never told anyone about what happened, but I still get chills thinking about that night. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the snow watching me. I'll never go back to that cabin again. I've always loved the idea of getting away from it all. The hustle and bustle of everyday life can get exhausting, and nothing sounded better than spending a few days in a remote cabin during winter. I rented one that seemed perfect, isolated, surrounded by forest, and about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The owners had a great reputation, and the pictures on their website showed a beautiful rustic cabin nestled in the woods. Perfect, right? I arrived just before dark, after a scenic drive through snowy roads. The last stretch of the journey was a little nerve-wracking, with the snow picking up and visibility decreasing. Still, I was looking forward to some quiet time, a break from work, and just being alone for a while. I pulled up to the cabin, its stone chimney puffing out a thin stream of smoke into the gray sky. It looked like something out of a winter postcard. I took a deep breath, unpacked my things, and made myself at home. The first night went smoothly. I lit a fire, cooked some dinner, and sat by the window to watch the snow fall, feeling totally at peace. The cabin was small but comfortable. It had the kind of charm that only an old, rustic place could have, the kind where you can almost hear the stories in the walls. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, just quiet, peace, and the crackling of the fire. As the evening wore on, the wind picked up, and the storm outside became stronger, but I didn't mind. It felt cozy. By midnight, though, I started hearing strange noises. At first, it sounded like someone was knocking at the door, but not in the usual way, more like soft tapping, almost like someone was trying to get my attention without being too obvious. I thought maybe it was the wind, maybe the snow hitting the windows or roof, but the more I listened, the more convinced I became that it wasn't just the storm. I walked to the door, peering out the small window beside it, but there was nothing. Just the swirling snow and the darkness. I checked the back window, the side windows, nothing. No footprints in the fresh snow outside. I figured it had to be my mind playing tricks on me, maybe from being in the quiet for so long. But that's when it started to feel wrong. I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. The room was warm, and the fire crackled, but it wasn't enough to calm me. Then I heard it again, soft tapping, like someone was at the door, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I was frozen in place, staring at the door. My heart started racing. I slowly stood up and went to the door again. No one was there, just a blizzard raging outside. But this time I felt something I hadn't before: cold air. It was like the temperature had dropped a few degrees in just a few moments, even though the fire was still burning in the hearth. The coldness didn't feel like just outside air, this was something different. It was as if the cold was creeping in from somewhere else. That's when I noticed something strange in the snow just outside the door. There were footprints, but they weren't mine. They were big, almost too big for anyone who would be out here in the storm. And they weren't spaced out like normal human tracks. They were too close together, like someone was walking with short, quick steps. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stared at the tracks. They led from the edge of the yard, right up to the door. And then they stopped. Just stopped. No further tracks. No sign of someone turning back or leaving. It was like they just disappeared. I didn't know what to think. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but there was no rational explanation. I locked all the doors, closed the curtains, and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I needed to sleep. I tried to go to bed, but every creak of the cabin's wood, every gust of wind, kept me wide awake. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for anything to happen. Around 3 a.m., I was shaken from a half-sleep by the sound of footsteps. They were muffled at first, but they were getting louder. Someone was walking outside. The steps were coming closer. I scrambled out of bed, heart racing, and went to the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I tried to peer into the darkness. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear the footsteps clearly now, crunching through the snow. They were circling the cabin. My stomach twisted with fear. The person or thing outside was walking slowly, methodically, like they were taking their time. I stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't know I was inside. Then, out of nowhere, the footsteps stopped. The silence was suffocating. The wind howled, and the snow battered the windows, but everything else was eerily quiet. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. For what felt like hours, I stood by the window, watching the snowstorm, straining to hear any sound. Finally, the morning light began to break through the storm. I felt exhausted, but couldn't bring myself to sleep. I gathered my things, packed up, and made my way out of the cabin. I never even checked to see if the footsteps were still there. I just wanted to leave. I drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I looked back at the cabin in my rearview mirror, I swear I saw something or someone standing by the window, watching me. I've never gone back, and I don't think I ever will. That cabin was supposed to be my safe haven, my escape from the world. Instead, it became the place where I learned that some things are better left alone, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. To this day, I still don't know what I encountered out there. I'm not sure if it was a person, a prank, or something else, but the feeling of being watched, of something circling me in the snow, still haunts me. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, I hear the soft sound of footsteps in the snow, and I'm reminded of that night. I've always loved the idea of a winter cabin getaway. There's something so peaceful about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow and trees, with only the crackling sound of a fire to break the silence. So when I had a week off work and needed a break, I rented a cabin in a remote area upstate. The pictures online were beautiful log cabin, fireplace, a view of the mountains covered in snow. It seemed like the perfect escape from everything. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The drive had been long and exhausting, and the snow made it feel even more remote. As I pulled into the driveway, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures, small, rustic, and charming. A good old-fashioned winter retreat. I couldn't wait to get inside and start my holiday. The first few hours were exactly what I needed. I unpacked, started a fire, and spent some time just enjoying the solitude. There was something magical about sitting by the fire, watching the snow fall outside. The place had an old, creaky vibe to it, but in a cozy, comforting way. The kind of place that made you feel like you could just forget about everything for a while. That night, as the wind howled outside and the snowstorm picked up, I went to bed early. It was peaceful, the kind of silence you only find in a remote cabin during a snowstorm. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something strange. A soft sound like a tapping on the window. I froze. I listened carefully, thinking it might be the wind or snow hitting the glass. But then it came again, tap, 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 tap. This was different. It wasn't wind or snow. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening for any other sounds. The storm was raging outside, but the tapping was constant, as if someone was outside, standing just beyond the window. I didn't move at first, thinking it could just be an animal or the wind playing tricks on me. But the tapping continued, growing more insistent. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect from a tree branch brushing the window. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone was out there, I was sure of it. I got up cautiously and approached the window. The snowstorm was so thick that I could barely see anything outside, but I squinted into the darkness. There was nothing there, no one. No footprints in the snow, no sign of movement. It felt like I had imagined the whole thing, but then I heard it again, a louder tap, followed by a soft scraping sound, like something was dragging across the window. I felt my blood run cold. That wasn't normal. I pulled the blinds shut and locked the window, trying to convince myself it was just the storm. I climbed back into bed, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. That night I couldn't sleep. Every small noise, every creak of the cabin, made me jump. I kept hearing the tapping outside, faint but persistent, like it was following me around the cabin. Finally, around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I needed to go outside and check. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a branch, anything to stop the constant fear building up inside me. I grabbed a flashlight and bundled up in my winter clothes. The wind was brutal as I stepped outside, and the snow was so deep that it made walking difficult. I shined the flashlight around the cabin, but there was nothing. The snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. I checked the windows, but everything was locked and secure. The cabin seemed completely empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. I stood outside for a few more minutes, trying to calm myself down. I had to be imagining things. It was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. I turned to go back inside, but as I walked toward the door, I heard it again right behind me. The sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. I spun around, my heart racing, and shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed, and there was no one there. But the footsteps kept coming, slow and deliberate. They weren't like the wind or a drifting snowflake. These were real, human footsteps. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My mind was racing, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. There was no way anyone could be out there. It was too cold, the storm was too heavy, and the cabin was miles away from the nearest house. No one could just walk up to it in the middle of the night. I checked every window, all the locks, and even the cellar, but still, there was no sign of anyone. I didn't sleep that night. Every little noise made me tense up. Every shadow outside the window sent a chill down my spine. The storm raged on, but I couldn't bring myself to relax. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. Something about that place didn't sit right with me anymore. The whole cabin felt off, like it was alive, watching me. I packed up quickly, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I just wanted to leave. As I was driving away, heading back down the long, winding road, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the window of the cabin, but when I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched never left me. It's been months since that trip, but I can't shake the memory of the footsteps in the snow, of the tapping on the window. I never found out who or what was outside that night, and honestly, I don't think I want to. The only thing I know for sure is that I'll never go back to that cabin. There are some places you just don't go back to, no matter how charming they look online. That was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a way to escape the chaos of life. But it turned into a nightmare, and to this day I still wonder if I was just dealing with an uninvited guest, or if something far worse was lurking in the snowstorm that night. It was meant to be the perfect winter vacation. After a long year of stress and chaos, I decided to book a remote cabin for some much-needed alone time. I had always been drawn to the idea of getting away from everything, no distractions, no noise, just the peaceful quiet of nature. I found a cabin tucked away in the mountains, far from any towns, with nothing but forest and snow for miles. The pictures were inviting, showing a rustic cabin with a large stone fireplace, old wooden furniture, and a porch with a view of the snowy expanse. It looked like the kind of place where I could read, write, and clear my head. The cabin was small but cozy, with just enough space for one person. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to set behind the peaks. The drive had been long, winding through snow-covered roads, and I was relieved to finally arrive. The silence of the place was almost overwhelming, but in a comforting way. I grabbed my bags, made my way to the door, and unlocked it with the key left in a small lockbox by the porch. The first thing I noticed was the air inside, the scent of aged wood mixed with something faintly musty. It wasn't unpleasant, but there was something about it that seemed a little off. The cabin felt still, as if it hadn't been lived in for a long time. The windows were clouded with frost, and there was a distinct chill in the air despite the fireplace being set up and ready to go. I started a fire, set down my bags, and began to unpack. The floorboards creaked as I moved around, the only sound breaking the silence. I tried to push aside the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was just the isolation, I told myself. I was used to city life, and the stillness of the cabin was a sharp contrast. But still, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. That night, after dinner, I settled in front of the fire with a book. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the cold outside, and for a while I felt at ease. The storm had picked up, the wind howling against the windows, but inside I was safe. As the night wore on, though, I started to hear something. At first, it was subtle, a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere in the cabin. I paused, holding my breath, trying to identify where it was coming from. It wasn't the wind, this was something else. The scratching was followed by a faint whisper, too soft to understand, but definitely there. I thought maybe it was just the house settling, but it didn't feel like that. It was like someone was standing just outside the room, speaking in low tones, their voice just beyond my reach. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. and made my way toward the source of the sound. I checked the window sill and went outside. I checked the door locked. The cabin was as still as ever, but the whispers persisted, growing louder. It sounded almost like someone was walking around the cabin, their footsteps faint and quick, like they were trying not to be heard. I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't alone in this cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way through the rooms, checking closets, the attic, and even the basement. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding inside. The whispers faded as I searched, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But then it happened again. The whispers. This time they came from the walls themselves. It was as if the sound was coming from the very bones of the cabin. I could hear them echoing through the wood, muffled yet distinct. I froze, heart racing. It was clear now it wasn't just my imagination. There was something in the cabin. I had no idea what it was, but it was real. I decided to leave the next morning. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was causing those noises. I grabbed my things, bundled up, and prepared to head back down the mountain. But just as I reached the door, I stopped. The whispers came again, louder this time, right behind me. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing but darkness. The fire had gone out, and the room felt cold, colder than before. I stepped back inside, not sure why, but it felt like I couldn't leave, not yet. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the corner of the room with the flashlight in hand, too terrified to sleep. The whispers didn't stop. Every now and then I would hear faint footsteps, the sound of something moving behind the walls, but each time I checked, there was nothing there. By morning, I was completely exhausted and frantic. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. The storm had passed, and there was a heavy, unnatural silence in the air. I gathered my things, stepped outside, and quickly made my way to the car. As I drove down the mountain, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in one of the windows, watching me leave. But when I looked again, it was gone. The cabin was empty, silent. I never went back to that cabin. The experience left me shaken, and to this day, I can't explain what happened. I've stayed in other remote cabins before, but I can't help but wonder if I stumbled upon something that night, something that's better left unexplained. Sometimes I wonder if it's the cabin that's haunted, or if it was something else entirely. Either way, I've made sure to stay far away from that part of the mountains. I don't know what it was that I encountered in that cabin, but I do know one thing: it wasn't just the isolation that made the place feel so wrong. There was something there, something I'll never fully understand, and I don't think I'll ever want to.